thanks for having me. I'm super happy to be here and talk about some of my favorite things, which are weather and clay and time. This question, where are you from? We get a lot if you are visiting or you're from the East Coast. Who's your father? Kind of jokes run rampant. So as Laura mentioned, I grew up in BC and I currently live in Halifax. And this is where I went to school when I went to art school and where I began to work with clay. I somehow completely avoided really getting into it before I got here, which is great because as soon as I had my first class in the ceramics department, it was just kind of like nothing else mattered. So I think if it had happened earlier, I wouldn't have gotten anything done. And I picked this picture as a bit of an introduction. This is a picture from me when I was, I think, 19 years old. And as I was putting the presentation together and I wanted to relate where I'm from and where clay comes from, I thought like, hey, we're kind of from the same place, actually. And so this is an introduction to me and my favorite medium. So I primarily work in ceramics, and I have recently in the last few years been exploring using found materials. And I say found materials, not like local materials or anything else, mostly because I am working very small scale and I gravitate towards kind of almost like the garbagiest version of things. So like things left by humans are of like my greatest interest. So like pieces of glass, pieces of metal that I find kind of like in trails and in streams of like where we have been collectively, what we have been doing. So on my left, it's a picture of kind of like part of my work table where I've been processing some found rocks and sand and glass and metal and misc stuff. And then on the right is an example of some work kind of like as it's gone through, and the design on the surface there is made with a variety of minerals and objects crushed up by me with my hammer there. Okay, so gonna tell you now about clay. So as I learn about things, like I think this has been kind of a consistent thing since I was born. But I like to take things apart and then kind of figure out what they're made of at the most basic level that I can see, and then sometimes put them together so that they work, or just put them together so that they do something else. I love to dissect things and rebuild them. And as I've learned more about clay, I approach it in a similar way. And for the last few years, as I've been experimenting with found materials, I've also been diving into like the short-term history of where the things are coming from that I'm not finding on the ground. So like base materials for clay bodies, very popular materials and glazes, things that we use in the ceramics world that you know, like at first interaction you would maybe find them just on the shelf at the store, and then in my head I'm like, okay, but how did they get to this store? Where did they come from? Tracing them back through. And as I learned in school and then have been learning since then, most of the ingredients that we use in ceramics come from large-scale industrial mining. And that surprised me because clay is like a very ubiquitous material. And for example, in Nova Scotia, it's not uncommon to just like go for a walk and kind of see the side of a hillside very like sloppy and clay-like, and you can pick it up and you can make like a little ball in your hand or something like that. So reconciling the current state of like our world and connecting the thing that I like to do, that I like to make like objects for people's homes and things like that, with this very intense practices of mining and etc. in other places in the world has been kind of like a constant exercise in challenging my cognitive dissonance there. Right, yes, sorry, got distracted. So this image here is just a very quick depiction of like how clay is made, and then how it's separated either, because it's made on the left there's like two kind of mountain peaks illustrating a bit of a catching area. So clay is like worn down rocks through wind and water and time to tiny, tiny, tiny particles that are like almost invisible to your eye. Like you can see, obviously you can see clay in a group on your hand, but the individual particles are too small for our eyes to see. And this happens through like thousands of years. A primary deposit means that the clay kind of like stays in this little bubble, and it's mostly just made of the same thing. And then a secondary deposit is clay particles that have been traveling by wind and water and erosion through land, and on their way, becoming more clay-like, and then also picking up impurities on their way and getting deposited at a different place, like at a secondary kind of location. So if you can imagine clay particles kind of like going down that river and then ending up somewhere else. And so scientifically, clay is like a very specific term to describe these very, very small particles. And these are just for reference. You don't have to memorize this, but like if you think of one piece of sand is like the big yellow, and then one piece of silt is the smaller yellow, and then one particle of clay would be that tiny red dot. And then there's a picture of the microscopic image of clay particles, and they're actually flat. They're kind of plate-like, and they're charged. They have a positive and a negative aspect, and that just allows them to stack really efficiently, like you can see in that picture. Like they're kind of like stacked exactly like plates. And I'm just going to go back to this one because this is nicer and simpler to look at. So for something to be clay, it has to be that tiny, tiny red dot size. And that's like 0.002 of a millimeter. So very, very small. And the property that is like makes clay magic is its plasticity, which allows it to do all of the wonderful things that we ask of it to do. So it allows us to like mold it into a specific shape, and it keeps that by the strength of like all of those plates kind of stacked together. It's almost like if you could imagine pushing at the side of a deck of cards, and then like the whole stack doesn't necessarily fall over, but you can move some of them. And so we do wild, wild, wild things with clay. Like clay ingredients are used in like paper production, fiberglass, cosmetics, packaging, paints, plastics, rubber, like just kind of like all over the map. And specifically, we use them for like loads of different kind of ceramic materials in industry and small scale, everything like that. And interestingly, like it is a non-renewable resource because it takes so long to make by the earth just like doing what it does with weather and with water. And yeah, that just like it is a little bit mind-boggling to me that like we could, if we wanted to, we could run out of clay fairly soon, and we wouldn't be able to make more except for by waiting and dying and decomposing and then being turned into those dust motes that Francis was talking about. So quick geography slide here. Again, I'm not going to quiz you on this. This is just me kind of sharing my map love. So in the continent that we call North America, some people call Turtle Island. I'm sure there's names that we've forgotten about that we can refer to this. You can kind of see on this map, the Rocky Mountains are like the yellower area, and the water is blue, and there's like the Appalachian Mountains on the East Coast there. And just for reference, I pulled out the Mississippi River watershed, which ends up kind of like in the Gulf of Mexico. And I don't know that much about the Mississippi River except for like songs and American folklore that makes its way up here. But that is a wild, huge watershed. And interestingly enough, there are huge clay deposits around the Mississippi River Delta, and in like Tennessee and in those states that are kind of like in the southern states, because of the amount of water and the amount of sediment that gets pulled into that area over time. And especially because it's pulling from the Great Plains, which is an old seabed. And so it has all of these like very, very, very ancient particles that are ready to be eroded and then pulled in to the water system, eroded further, and then mixed into and like deposited as clay deposits in the south of the state. Okay, something funny was that I went looking for pictures of mines in Canada and in the States, and it was a bit difficult to find, but it was not difficult to find pictures of clay mines in the UK. So one of the main ingredients that I use in my clay body is graulag kaolin, which is just like clay talk for white clay. And here's a picture of one of the mines that it is from in Cornwall in the UK. And on their website, they're like quite proud of this picture and they call it a quarry. Whereas I think it's much more common in Canada to refer to this as like a mountaintop removal mine and or open pit, depending on kind of like the process that's happening here. And this is a picture from Plainsman Clay, which is a company that operates out of Alberta. And interestingly, they were able to explain that this person is standing in front of like all of these layers of sediment. And within this photograph, they have picked out at least, I think, like 9 different specific geographically timed clays or whatever. So it looks kind of like all similar in the photograph. And then they've separated them out and fired them to different temperatures on the side there, which I think is a good example from there. And then I've redrawn the map a little bit with important clay notes on them. And Plainsman clay, as you can tell, is in the plains there. And that would be like a secondary fire clay that has ended up in the plains because of like that's coming through the surface through erosion and things like that. And you can see that I've marked off Weakley County, which is the largest secondary, like one of the largest secondary clay deposits in the United States. And then also I made a little note for Shaw Resources, which is in Nova Scotia, which is one of the largest resource mining companies in Nova Scotia. And my favorite little story about Shaw is that for a couple years, I worked at a professional fine art potter in Lunenburg named Joan Bruneau. I worked at her studio as her assistant. And she uses like quite a local clay body. She mixes it herself and she gets the ingredients brought in and tries to source things as locally as possible. And her main ingredient in her clay, the red clay that anybody who's been to Nova Scotia would recognize just from their boots after walking in the rain, she gets it from Shaw, which originally was a brick manufacturing company, and then they've expanded and now they do quite a bit more. But it was always and has been like such a byproduct of their other resource extraction that the clay body ingredients that she and many other people, including NASCAD, buy from them is collected in the factory just from the floor. It's like the dust that they use or that they can collect when they're making bricks. And she told me this one day when I was like making things, and I was like, oh, there's so much wood in this batch for some reason. There's like all these slivers, like, did something break in the studio? And she was like, oh no, I actually think probably that came from the factory. Like sometimes there's just something's happened and there's like crumbs in something, you get it from other places. And that just really highlighted for me like the memory that clay has like physically within it of everywhere that it has been and everywhere that it's like gone through and pulled impurities, quote unquote, with it as colorants and as like firing properties and all of these other things. And then also like in the larger sense, like how to borrow Lisa's words from an exhibition that was a part of the weather stories before, like everything that we have done is weather now, and everything that we will do will become weather again, including like the way that it will be evidenced in our particles for as long as they are like eatable by wind and water. Almost done. And so just to tie this back to my practice a little bit, here's an example of some of the found materials that I've been testing, and their little form in the bottom with my notes of like where they're from. And then some of the colors and the firing properties are in the middle row there of like how they can be introduced into ceramics practices.